Chang Yue, following the rhymes of yin mo's floating on Lake Dongting. A continuous gaze over the level lake, stretching upward to the heavens. The autumn scene falls 1,000 feet, piercing the streams. Then suddenly I am startled at how light fills the water. And it seems I'm riding my boat to the very edge of the sun. So here we will be talking about a contribution by Chang Yue. Chang Yue was not included in the 300 Tang Poems anthology, so some biographical background is in order. So Chang Yue is very similar to one figure that does appear in the anthology, Zhang Juling. Chang Yue was one of those few, very few Tang poets who actually was more important as a politician than as a poet. He fulfilled the dream of almost the entirety of Tang poets of having a successful civil service career and reaching the upper echelons of government. He lived in the late 7th century, early 8th. He was at the court of Empress Wu, but he mainly came to occupy positions of power during the early reign of Emperor Xuanzong Li Longji. So he was a friend of this emperor from before the time he reached the throne, and under him he reached, the highest posts in the bureaucracy. He became secretariat or chancellery chief, so a chancellor. Now, he had ups and downs in his career. Nevertheless, he was sent to the provinces a couple of times, and he was ennobled. He was given a title, and during the early years of Emperor Xuanzong's reign, Emperor Xuanzong had a very long reign from 710 to 756, 57. So in the early years of Xuanzong's reign, let's say in the 10s, 20s, maybe 30s, he was not only a very highly placed civil servant at the head of the bureaucracy almost, he was also a patron of other writers, and many young writers came to him for inspiration. One of those that came was Zhang Juling, who later on would adopt the same role as this patron with respect to the high Tang poets of the 740s, 50s. So Zhang Yue, important poet, head of the bureaucracy, he's also, a lot of poems of his have been preserved, like at least 350, which is rather unusual for a poet of the late 7th, early 8th century. And the critical consensus, especially as represented by Stephen Owen, is, it's, let's say, it's pretty dismissive of Zhang Yue, considering him not too good a poet, not too excellent a poet. The reason why he has so many poems preserved is because of the high rank that he achieved. So contemporary poets to Chang Yue, who were probably better than him, we know nothing about them because they didn't reach high office, or almost nothing. And we've only had some of their poems preserved in anthologies. Of Chang Yue, we have, as I said, 350, which is an enormous amount of poems. And he is a transitional figure, just as in his chronology. He bridges the gap between the early Tang and the high Tang. It is especially evident in the development of his late and his exile poetry. Owen comments, probably without any irony intended, that exile generally has a salubrious effect on court poets because it forces them to write a poetry that is more full of authentic feeling from a Western aesthetical and critical point of view, instead of the effete but artificial celebratory poems of the court that are typical of court poetry. So this man, Chen Yue, he would have been a contemporary of Zhong Jiwen and Shen Xuanqi, the doyens of the early Tang high court poetry. But as I said, he is also a contemporary and a patron of Zhang Juling and of some of the high Tang poets in his last years, perhaps. Owen also says about his style that he is good at endings. He has his ability to make good witty endings, but he is pretty useless at making good descriptive parallelistic couplets. So he tends to excel. His poems tend to be at their best when he is writing quatrains, for example, which do not rely on a pair of middle couplets with strong and effective descriptive parallelism. And as I've mentioned, he says that, the best poems that Zhang Yue has are generally the poems he wrote while in exile. And he explains, if you're interested, in quite a bit of detail in the last chapter of the Poetry of the Early Tang, the evolution of Zhang Yue, where he retains some elements of the courtly style, but at the same time he is infusing them with the new subjectivity, complexity of character and thought, and freedom from rigid generic conventions that will be characteristic of the high Tang poetry. Now, out of the poems I've read of him lately, the one I liked the most was a poem he has on a historical theme, the Song of Jie, which includes a couple of images like smashing phalanxes and splendid chambers, which are quoted in a doctoral dissertation on the poetry of Zhang Yue, which I haven't read yet, but which is waiting for when I have the time. But I have decided not to read you that poem, but this one, this following the rhymes of Jin Mo's floating on Lake Dongting. Why? This is a quatrain, a heptasyllabic quatrain. It exhibits, according to Owen's analysis and commentary, the cleverness and the wittiness and the most characteristically Zhang Yue elements in which he is transitioning. He is mixing the high court style with intimations of the new high Tang sense of poetic unity. It's a poem written in exile when he was in the south of China, so it has a real feeling in it. So it's probably very representative and one of the best in Zhang Yue's style. So we read the poem at the beginning. So let's start with commenting a little bit about it. The topic of the poem is there's a landscape element. He is describing Lake Dongting. So that would be the main element in the poem, description of a beautiful landscape. From the title, we know that it's a poem following the rhymes of Jing Mo. So this is a very typical, we've mentioned it before, it's a very typical type of court poem, which is someone makes a poem and you write back, like extemporaneously, a poem that employs the same rhyme scheme and the same rhymes as the first poem. And sometimes it also reworks the themes and wording of the first poem, but it has to take it in some other direction. So we may imagine that Zhang Yue is in exile with a friend, Jin Mo, who is also in exile. They're in Lake Dongting, in the Central Lake Sea area of southern China, which has appeared in a lot of the poems of the 300 Tang poems. And, the context of production of this poem is the typical courtly context, although this is not the court, this is between scholar officials, but it's, I write a poem, you answer back with another poem. But as opposed to the original, which according to Owen is a pretty bland court poem, Zhang Yue's answer really shows that it belongs to the new age that is coming, the high Tang. Let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. So, first couplet, a continuous gaze over the level lake, stretching upward to the heavens. So the first couplet begins with a very conventional, if you wish, very courtly image that is to be expected, which is the image of a vast expanse of water seemingly merging with the heavens. And we've seen this a lot in descriptions of the ocean or in descriptions of big lakes or even of big rivers. This idea that the waters extend so much that they reach the horizon and they seem to merge with the sky. So this is not very original, but the interesting thing will be how Zhang Yue really sets up each of the couplets so that they are not just independently juxtaposed pretty images, they're building up towards the concluding couplet. So we start with this image. There's a big lake. The poet is gazing at it. It extends everywhere. It seems to merge with the heavens. Second couplet. The autumn scene falls 1,000 feet, piercing the streams. So not the second couplet, sorry, the second line. This is a quatrain. So the first one was first line, second line, sorry. The autumn scene falls 1,000 feet, piercing the streams. So the second line brings the season, so it's autumn, which remember always comes with associations of sadness, melancholy, etc. And it continues with a descriptive element, but it brings a theme of darkness also, like of the shadows of the trees, of the different elements of nature, of the mountains next to the lake are reflected on the waters, and this reflection is evoked through a dynamic, even violent image. The verb is fall. The scene falls 1,000 feet, so from the mountains that are surrounding the lake, and it pierces the streams. You have this very violent image of the shadows coming down and penetrating the mirror-like surface of the waters of the lake and the rivers that feed into it. This darkness, this autumn scene, which falls 1,000 feet, this is the theme of the darkness of the autumn landscape, casting a shadowy reflection down on the lake, prepares us for the illumination that comes in the second couplet, in the third and fourth lines. The third line, then suddenly I am startled at how light fills the water. So we get a translation. We didn't know where the poet was, but now, or at least in the last line, we will see that the poet is in a boat crossing Lake Dongting. Well, we knew that from the title because, they were following the rhymes of Jingmo's floating on Lake Dongting, but Chang Yue is also floating on Lake Dongting. So the third line brings this blaze of light which almost blinds or at least startles the poet. Light is filling the water. The sunlight is filling the water, and it contrasts with the previous line, with the shadows that were creeping onto the lake. The sunlight suddenly fills the water. The boat ride on the gleaming lake becomes, something blinding, and the reflected sunlight. Maybe it's setting sunlight, or that's not clear, but it creates a polished mirror of brightness over the waters. Last line, and it seems I'm riding my boat to the very edge of the sun. Now, again, as the sunlight fills the water, the boat ride on the waters becomes like a journey through the heavens to the edge of the sun. Now, this image is pretty conventional. We encounter it in a lot of courtly poems. There's this legend of a man who, went in a boat, floating around and ended up floating up in the heavens. This sort of witty image of the end of comparing any ride in a boat over the waters to this mythical rides on boats through the heavens. This is a staple fare of courtly poetry, but here, as opposed to in court poems, it has been built up in a very ingenious and witty way through the different couplets of the poem, whereas in a conventional court poet, you might expect this witty image to appear at the end, but the construction of the previous lines wouldn't be, working clearly towards this transformation of this simple ride into a transcendental experience. So, interesting poem. Very short, as I said, it's a quatrain, 2 couplets, 4 lines, but I think it very well represents what could be described as the transition from the early to the high Tang style.